Rand Paul spoke to students at Howard University. The Kentucky Republican talked about his party's history of opposing slavery and about civil rights. Howard University, located in Washington, D.C., is a historically black college founded after the Civil War. Senator Paul also took questions at this 50-minute event.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank President Rabeau, former Mayor Schmoke, and Howard University faculty and students for letting me come today. Now, some people have asked me, are you nervous about speaking at Howard? They say, you know, some of the students there, they may be Democrats. So my response has been, you know what? The trip will be a success if I can get the Hilltop to have a headline that says, a Republican came to Howard, but he came in peace. My wife Kelly asked me last week, she said, do you ever have doubts? Do you ever have doubts about trying to advance a message for an entire country? The truth is, sometimes. When I do have doubts, I think of a line from T.S. Eliot, a line that says, how should I presume to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways, and how should I presume? And when I think of how political enemies often twist and distort my positions, I think again of Eliot's words, and I think, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, how should I presume? And here I am today at Howard, a historically black college. Here I am, a guy who once presumed to discuss a section of the Civil Rights Act. That didn't always go so well for me. Some have said that I'm either brave or crazy to be here today. I've never been, though, one to sit by and watch the world go by without participating. I wake up every day hoping to make a difference. I take to heart the words of Toni Morrison of Howard University, who wrote, if there is a book you really want to read that hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Now, I can recite lots of books that have been written, or I can plunge into the arena and stumble, maybe fall, but at least I will have tried. What I'm about is a philosophy that leaves you to fill in the blanks. I came to Howard today not to preach or prescribe to you some special formula for you, but to say that I want a government that leaves you alone, that encourages you to write the book that becomes your future. You're more important than any political party, more important than any political pleadings or partisan pleadings. The most important thing you will do is yet to be seen. For me, I found my important thing to do when I learned to do surgery on the eye, when I learned to restore people's vision. I found what was important when I met my wife, when I got married. Many of you have those things that lay ahead of you. Although I'm an eye surgeon first and foremost, I find myself at this particular time in a debate over how we heal our sick economy and how we get people back to work. I truly believe that we have an economy that could create millions of jobs, but we have to rethink our arguments and try to rise above partisan rhetoric. My hope is that you'll hear me out, that you'll see me for who I am and not a caricature that's sometimes presented by political opponents. If you hear me out, I believe you'll discover that what motivates me more than any other issue is the defense of everyone's rights. Of strong importance to me is the defense of minority rights, not just racial minorities, but ideological and religious minorities. If our government does not protect the rights of minorities, then democratic majorities could simply legislate away our freedoms. The Bill of Rights and Civil War amendments protect us against the possibility of oppressive federal or state government. The fact that we are a constitutional republic means that certain inalienable rights are protected even from democratic majorities. The majority can't vote to take away your rights. They're yours. They're given to you by your Creator. No Republican questions or disputes civil rights. I've never wavered in my support for civil rights or the Civil Rights Act. The dispute, if there is one, has always been about how much of the remedy should come under federal or state or private purview. What gets lost is that the Republican Party has always been the party of civil rights and voting rights. Because Republicans believe that the federal government is limited, though, and that its function is limited by the Constitution, some have concluded that Republicans are somehow inherently insensitive to minority rights. Nothing could be further from the truth. Republicans do indeed still believe many rights remain with the people and the states respectively. When some people hear that, they tune us out and they say, oh, he's just using code words for states' rights to discriminate, for the states' rights to segregate and to abuse. But that's just simply not true. Many Republicans do believe that decentralization of power is the best policy, that government is more efficient, more just, and more personal when it's smaller and more local. But Republicans also realize that there are occasions, and have been occasions, of such egregious injustice that they do require federal involvement, that's precisely what the 14th Amendment was about and what the Civil Rights Act was intended to do: protect citizens from state and local tyranny. The 14th Amendment says, no state shall. The 14th Amendment did change the Constitution to give a role for the federal government in protecting citizenship and voting, regardless of race. Now, I didn't live through segregation, nor did I experience it firsthand. I did grow up in the South, in public schools. I went to schools with whites, blacks, Latinos. We all seemed to pretty much get along. So perhaps some will say that I can't understand. But I don't think you had to be there to be affected by our nation's history of racial strife. The tragedy of segregation and Jim Crow in the South is compounded when you realize that integration began in New England in 1840s and 1850s. In 1841, Frederick Douglass is pulled from the white car on the Eastern Railroad, clutching his seat so tightly that when he's thrown from the train, the remnants of the seat are still in his hands. But within a few years, public transportation was integrated in the Northeast. It's a stain on our history that integration didn't occur for more than 100 more years in the South. In the 1960s, we were still fighting to integrate transportation in schools, and that was and is an embarrassment. But the story of emancipation, of voting rights, and of citizenships from Frederick Douglass to the modern era is really, in fact, the history of the Republican Party. How did the party that elected the first black U.S. senator, the party that elected the first 20 African-American congressmen, how did that party become a party that now loses 95% of the black vote? How did the Republican Party, the party of the great emancipator, lose the trust and faith of an entire race? From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, for a century, most black Americans voted Republican. How did we lose that vote? To understand how Republicans lost the African-American vote, we must first understand how we won the African-American vote. In Kentucky, the history of black voting rights is inseparable from the Republican Party. After the Civil War, virtually all African-Americans became Republicans. Democrats in Louisville were led by the Courier-Journal editor, Henry Watterson, and they were implacably opposed to blacks voting. The Democrats, to a person, were opposed to blacks voting. Watterson himself, who was the editor for 30 or 40 years of the Courier-Journal, wrote that his opposition to blacks voting was founded upon the conviction that their habits of life and general condition disqualified them from the judicious exercise of suffrage. This was the Democrats. In George Wright's Life Behind the Veil, he writes of Republican General John Palmer standing before tens of thousands of slaves on July 4th, 1865, when slavery still existed in Kentucky, and declaring, "My countrymen, you are free, and while I command the military forces of the United States, will defend your right to freedom." And the crowd erupted in cheers. This is the history of the Republican Party. Meanwhile, Kentucky's Democrat-controlled legislature voted against the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. In Louisville, William Worley was a black Republican. He was born at the end of the 19th century. He was a founder of Louisville's NAACP. He's a Republican. Most of the founders of the NAACP were Republicans. He's famous, though, for fighting and overturning the notorious Louisville segregated housing ordinance. Worley bought a house in a white section in defiance of a city segregation law. The case, Buchanan v. Worley, was finally decided by the Supreme Court in 1917, unanimously holding that the Kentucky law could not forbid the sale of a house based on race. The Republican Party's history is rich and chock full of emancipation and black history. Republicans still prize the sense of justice that MLK spoke of when he said that an unjust law is any law that a majority enforces on a minority but does not make binding upon itself. I wasn't sure if my speech would be entertaining, but now you've had some entertainment. When MLK talked about an unjust law, what always has intrigued me about this is a lot of the things MLK talked about were race, but really what he talked about when he talked about what was a just law goes beyond race. So listen to this again. He said that an unjust law, and this is a good way to look at any law, an unjust law is any law that a majority, not just a racial majority, any majority, enforces on a minority but does not make binding on themselves. It means any law that's not universally applied. Any law that applies to just bankers would be not racist but would be unjust. Any law that just applied to one particular group would be unjust. Now, he was referring to race, but he said something about unjustness that applies to all law. Republicans have never stopped believing that minorities, whether they derive from the color of your skin or the shade of your ideology, should warrant equal protection. Everyone knows of the sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville, but few people remember the sit-in in Alexandria Public Library in 1938. Samuel Tucker, a lawyer and a graduate of Howard University, recruited 5 young African-American men to go to the public library, select a book, and sit and read until they were forcibly removed. In 1938, the sit-ins of the 1960s had a lot of and long history before. Tucker's sit-in set the stage, though, for students who organized a sit-in at Woolworths in Greensboro that brought down Jim Crow in many areas years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think that in our retelling of the Civil Rights era, we don't give enough credit to the heroism of the civil disobedience that brought down Jim Crow. You may say, oh, that's all well and good, but that was a long time ago. What have you done for me lately? I think what happened during the Great Depression was that African Americans understood that Republicans did champion citizenship and voting rights, but they became impatient because they wanted economic emancipation. African Americans were languishing, and they languished below white Americans in every measure of economic success. And the Depression was especially harsh for those who were on the lowest rung of poverty at that time. The Democrats promised equalizing outcome. Everybody will get something through unlimited federal assistance, while Republicans offered something that seemed to be less tangible, the promise of equalizing opportunity through free markets. Now, Republicans face a daunting task. Several generations of black voters have never voted Republican and are not very open to considering the option. Democrats still promise unlimited federal assistance, and Republicans still offer free markets, low taxes, less regulation, but because we truly believe it will create millions of jobs for everyone. The Democrat promise is tangible, puts food on the table, but too often, I think, doesn't lead to jobs or meaningful success. The Republican promise is for policies that create economic growth. We believe lower taxes, less regulation, balanced budgets, a solvent Social Security, a solvent Medicare will all stimulate growth. Republicans point to the Reagan era, when the economy grew at 7%. We added 8 million jobs in a few years during the Reagan administration. If we did that again, we could conceivably create 12 million jobs, and we're creating almost no jobs at this point. Today, after 4 years of the current policy, 1 in 6 Americans live in poverty, more than at any time in recent history. In fact, the poor have grown poorer in the last 4 years. Black unemployment is 14%, nearly twice the national average. This is unacceptable. Using taxes to punish the rich, in reality, punishes everyone because we're all interconnected. High taxes and excessive regulation and massive debt are not working. This isn't just Democrats, it's Democrats and Republicans that have been piling on the debt, but the debt is a burden for you. The debt is an impediment to you getting a job when you leave here. The economy's been growing at less than 1% and actually contracted in the last quarter of last year. I would argue that the objective evidence shows that big government is not a friend to African Americans. Big government relies on the Federal Reserve, our central bank, to print money out of thin air. Printing money out of thin air leads to higher prices. When the prices of gas rise to $4 a gallon, it's a direct result of your government's debt. When food prices rise, it's a direct result of $50,000 we borrow every second. Inflation hurts everyone, particularly the poor. If you're struggling to get ahead, if you have student loans and personal debt, you should choose a political party that wants to leave more money in the private sector so you'll get a job when the time comes. Some Republicans, let's call them the moss-covered variety, mistake war for defense. They forget that Reagan argued for peace through strength, not war through strength. The old guard argues for arming Gaddafi, and then the next year they argue that we want boots on the ground to defeat Gaddafi. They've got to be involved everywhere all the time. I want you to know that there are Republicans who don't clamor for war, that many Republicans believe in a strong national defense that serves to preserve the peace. In Louisville, in the predominantly African-American west end of town, it was recently announced that 18 school districts are failing, or 18 schools. The graduation rate from high school is 40%. The head of Kentucky's education called it academic genocide. Johns Hopkins researchers call these schools dropout factories. I defy anyone to watch Waiting for Superman and honestly argue against school choice. A minister friend of mine in the West End calls school choice the civil rights issue of our day. I think he's right. By the 6th grade, Ronald Halassi was failing most of his classes, but through school choice, he was able to attend a Catholic school here in D.C. There, he learned that he had a natural gift for composing music. For that, he wasn't even reading. His reading level was so low that he struggled to even write lyrics. Ronald then went on to matriculate at Barry University. There are countless examples of the benefits of school choice. Talk to the parents of these kids. Look at the kids that were interviewed in the movie Waiting for Superman. Maybe it's about time we all reassess blind allegiance to ideas that are failing our children. Every child in every neighborhood of every color, class, and background deserves a school that will help them succeed. Those of you assembled today are the American success stories. You will make it and do great things. But in every neighborhood, white, black, or brown, there are kids who are not succeeding because they simply made mistakes or they messed up. They had kids maybe before they were married or before they were old enough to support them, or they got hooked on drugs, or they simply left school. Republicans are often miscast as uncaring or condemning of kids who make bad choices. I, for one, plan to change that. I'm working with Democratic senators to make sure that kids who have made bad decisions, such as nonviolent possession of drugs, are not imprisoned for lengthy sentences. I'm working to make sure that first-time offenders are put into counseling and not imprisoned with hardened criminals. We should not take away anyone's future over one mistake. Let me tell you the story of two young men. Both of them made mistakes. Both of them were said to have used illegal drugs. One of them was white, from a privileged background. He had important friends, an important father, and an important grandfather. You know, the kind of family who universities name dorms after. This family had more money than you could count. Drugs or no drugs, his family could buy justice if he needed it. The other man also used illegal drugs, but he was of mixed race and from a single-parent household with little money. He didn't have important friends or a wealthy father. Now, you may think I'm going to tell you a story about racism in America where the rich white kid gets off and the black kid goes to jail. It could be, and often is, but that's not this story. In this story, both young men were extraordinarily lucky. Both young men were not caught using illegal drugs, and they weren't imprisoned. Instead, they went on to become presidents of the United States. Barack Obama and George Bush were lucky. The law could have put both of them away for their entire young adulthood. Neither one of them would have been employable, much less president. Some argue with evidence that our drug laws are biased, that they are the new Jim Crow. But to simply be against them for that reason misses a larger point. They are unfair to everyone, white, black, brown, largely because of this idea that one size fits all, this idea that federal sentences should have no discretion. Our federal mandatory minimum sentences are simply heavy-handed and arbitrary. They can affect anyone at any time, though they disproportionately affect those without the means to fight them. We should stand and loudly proclaim, enough's enough. We should not have laws that ruin the lives of young men and women who have committed no violence. That's why I've introduced a bill to repeal mandatory minimum sentences. We should not have drug laws or a court system that disproportionately punishes the black community. The history of African American repression in this country rose from government-sanctioned racism. It's important to remember that, from government-sanctioned racism. Jim Crow laws were a product of bigoted state and local governments. Big and oppressive government has long been the enemy of freedom, something black Americans know all too well and on a personal level. We must always embrace individual liberty and enforce the constitutional rights of all Americans, rich and poor, immigrant and native, black or white. Such freedom is essential in achieving any long-standing health and prosperity. As Toni Morrison said, write your own story. Challenge mainstream thought. I hope that some of you will be open to the Republican message that favors choice in education, a less aggressive foreign policy, more compassion regarding nonviolent crime, and encourages opportunity in employment. And when the time is right, I hope that African Americans will again look to the party of emancipation, civil liberty, and individual freedom. Thank you very much.